The Division Remission is a comic that was released back in 2019, but was only available in French. It has since been released in English as of December 2021. In this video, I'll be covering the story from a narrative point of view. This is a little different to how the story is told from the character's viewpoint, but I've done my best with maintaining the overall direction. However, for the full experience, I would definitely recommend getting the comic, either online or hard copy, as this will provide a better idea of the story, showing a full extent of the characters involved. Otherwise, this is your last warning. If you haven't read the comic yet, and you're intending to, this video will contain spoilers. While clearing out a group of hyenas who are guarding a facility, the cell leader, Bruce, receives a message on his beeper. Help captured by hyenas. At the Lincoln statue. Come quick. The beeper isn't a standard piece of SHD equipment. This was just something Bruce has had since he was a kid, and given the current situation, where 4G and computer networks are down, beepers come out on top. They communicate via radio signals, plus they can't be hacked. The message he received was from a close friend of his called Mike, so he quickly gathers together 5 other agents and they make their way to the location of the statue. When they arrive at the location given to him by his friend, they find a large group of hyenas concentrated in one area. One of them, presumably the group's leader, is preaching about their cause, while the rest of them cheer him on. Bruce and the other agents then watch on as a group of people are herded towards the statue at gunpoint. The hyena's leader then commands them to climb up. It was at that moment that Mike received a message from Bruce, telling him and the other hostages to take cover. A single shot is fired. It pierces the canister on the back of one of the hyenas. There is a small explosion, and before the rest of them can react, the division agents are upon them and demanding they drop their weapons, or they will open fire. Predictably, the hyenas raise their weapons. Although they vastly outnumbered the agents, they were no match for them. The gunfire could be heard across the district. Mike received a message from another friend he eluded of his capture, John. He told him he was fine and that the division had saved him. Bruce and the other agents gathered the hostages and told them that they would escort them to a safe house, the theatre. On their way, Mike and John continued to message each other. John, who was close by to the fight with the hyenas, had spotted Bruce and was surprised to learn that he was a division agent. He hadn't seen him in over a year and well before the pandemic. Mike and John had kept in close contact with each other over the years, since the disappearance of Janice, another childhood friend. Before they reached the settlement, Mike sent one more request to John. He asked if he could go to his house and see if his wife and child were okay. They could be located in his panic room. Now safe in the settlement, Mike and Bruce finally had a chance to catch up. Mike explains that John is going to get his family to safety. Bruce admits that he hasn't seen him in a long time, but that he was never too worried about him. He always seemed to know how to look after himself. Mike's talents were recognized from a very young age, and he was even the one who managed to hook up the power to their childhood treehouse. Mike, John, Bruce, and Janice would spend all of their spare time there. This is when Janice first borrowed, or stole rather, a bunch of beepers from a local electronics store. After Mike configured them, the 4 of them would use these to communicate and keep track of each other. Just then, the sound of a police siren pierced the air, and it was rapidly getting closer. Consequently, it stopped outside of the treehouse. Janice had been residing there with her younger brother, and now their father wanted his son to come home. Their dad was an abusive drunk. The neighbors knew it, the kids knew it, the police knew it, and yet he was still granted full custody thanks to his friend who was a judge on the case. Janice leapt down from the treehouse, screaming that she would never let him hurt them again. Then, without warning, she pulled a knife on her father, threatening to slash him, and the police automatically drew their weapons. The boys quickly descended the treehouse ladder, bringing her brother with them. Mike spoke to her, promising they would check in and keep a close eye on her dad, but right now, she needed to drop the knife. Upset, Janice conceded. The police then guided her brother into the car, and then left, taking him and her father home. John made it to Mike's neighborhood. Mike had done well for himself through his career in computer science, so this was quite a nice area before the outbreak. While making his way into the building, he could hear a noise coming from downstairs in the wine cellar. In front of him were 5 hyena members attempting to pry open one of the panels. John introduced himself, telling them to step aside, saying that he was a hyena too and is a good friend of one of the council members. The hyenas told him to get lost. Undeterred, John raises his weapon, and after a short burst of gunfire, their bodies littered the ground. He then shouted out to Mike's wife, saying that he was here to help take them somewhere safe. Recognizing John, they opened the door. They packed up some things, including Mike's old backpack. But as they were leaving the cellar, one of the hyenas raised their arm and fired in their direction. John quickly turns and guns them down. None of them were hit, but the bullet had pierced through Mike's bag. John stopped to check that everything inside was okay, when he suddenly discovered something that shocked him. When Janice disappeared, all she said to the guys was that she had no choice, but she needed to go away. Mike said that he saw police outside her house while he was on his way to the treehouse. Inside, they turn on the TV to see if it mentions anything about it on the news. The reporter on the TV announces that 2 bodies have been found. Janice's father had been stabbed to death, but before this, he had murdered his son. Janice was the prime suspect, as she had been caught threatening her father in front of police officers, but she had escaped using her father's car. Bruce, John, and Mike grew up together. They were big comic book fans, but felt they never fit in with the other kids, so they decided to go out and build a treehouse so they would have somewhere quiet to read their comics. They got to work, but quickly realized that this was a little over their head. One day, Janice showed up, saying that she'd been watching their progress over the last few days. The boys knew of Janice. She had a reputation around school as someone you really didn't want to cross. She offered to help, explaining that she had built a couple of tree houses in the past. She had also brought along a number of materials that she had stolen from the local hardware store. And 3 years later, they were chilling in their treehouse. Janice took care of everything, and by this stage, they were an inseparable group of friends. After Janice's disappearance, everything changed. The boys stopped seeing each other so much and started drifting apart, but they agreed to meet up once a year at the treehouse on the day of her disappearance to remember her. Mike would get deep into his studies, attending prestigious universities, eventually creating a company that made it big in apps. John isolated himself, becoming obsessed with survival. And Bruce focused on sport before eventually being contacted by the Division. John makes his way to the hyena camp. At the gate, he gives the password and his identification. After only making it in a few steps, he is jumped by a group of hyena members. He was brought in front of the council member, who proceeded to question him on why he attacked and killed his fellow hyena allies. John goes on to explain that the men in the cellar were going to ruin his big plan, that he has a way of acquiring enough materials, supplies, and weapons to have them live like kings. John continues by telling the council member how he had gained the trust of an individual inside the theatre settlement, and after securing his wife and child, he had them locked away, so the husband would do anything he commanded of him. John spent the next several days working on his plan. Using the information being fed back from Mike, he was able to learn the layout, the number of guards, the patrol routines, how they react to attacks in the areas around them, and where the supplies are being stored. On Sunday night, Bruce receives a message on his beeper from Janice. He has a lot of ground to cover in a short period of time, so he rushes to get ready and runs out the door, leaving the camp behind him. Out of breath, having run the whole way there, he climbs the treehouse, when suddenly he takes a blow to the side of his head, knocking him out cold. Bruce wakes several hours later. He is still in the treehouse, but his hands are bound. He calls out for Janice, but no one is there. Cutting himself free, he makes his way out of the treehouse. Once on the ground, he sees the smoke in the distance, coming from the theatre settlement. When he arrives back at camp, the damage is extensive. One of the guards explained that they managed to get in when the guard changed. They ran through the compound like they owned the place. They knew their way around. They must have had someone on the inside. Bruce found one of his fellow agents and he explained what happened. That the first rocket was fired on the Division agents, who were on the rooftop at the time. Bruce's heart sank. Katie, one of the agents, was someone he was having a relationship with, the only positive thing he'd had in his life since the pandemic began. He found her in the hospital, bandaged from head to toe. She didn't look like she had much time. She managed to utter a few words to Bruce about how after the explosion she saw Mike talking to one of the hyenas, whose name was John. Katie's speech was cut off mid-sentence as her body began seizuring. The medical staff rushed in, pushing him out of the room. Rather than watching through the window, he returned to his room, taking her possessions with him, when something suddenly dropped from the bag and landed between his feet. It was a pregnancy test, and it was positive. Bruce spent the remainder of the day in his room, grieving and destroying everything in sight. By nighttime, he had finally decided to emerge. He hands his room keys over and tells them that he's leaving the settlement, that he has always fought for justice, but now that time is over, and the only thing left is revenge. Bruce enters Mike's house and discovers the panic room and a number of dead hyenas outside. If John is a hyena, why would he be killing other hyenas? Maybe John has his wife and daughter held hostage. Before leaving, he grabs his ID and passport in hopes that these might help him find Mike. With help from Odessa Sawyer, Bruce manages to locate some family members of John's at a refugee camp. They tell him about someone called Jaw. John used to hang out with him before the pandemic, that he would get him into a bit of trouble, and that they joined the hyenas together. Odessa is aware of Jaw. She explains that he controls all of the southeast suburbs. Bruce intends to attack their main camp alone, a suicide mission, that he just doesn't want to get anyone else hurt. Odessa talks him around, saying that she has been in contact with the other agents he was traveling with up until recently. Mike has been strapped down to a bed. John is leaning over the bed, interrogating him on why he found Janice's beeper and knife in his bag all these years later. Mike started his story from the beginning. He and Janice were in a relationship, but had chosen to keep it a secret. Whenever they weren't at the treehouse, they were at her father's house, to keep an eye out for a younger brother and try to protect him. One night they heard screams coming from the house, and they rushed inside to find her little brother lying on the ground with blood around his head and an empty bottle. Janice ran over to his still and lifeless body and soon after pulled out her knife. Yet just as quickly, she was kicked to the ground by her father. The knife landed at Mike's feet. He picked it up and rushed towards the man, forcefully driving the knife through his chest. While Janice's father desperately tried to kick back, Mike continued to stab him over and over again. Janice attempted to pull her father off Mike, but in the altercation, she too ended up being struck in the chest. Mike had killed both of them. The Division launched a full attack on the hyena compound. Taken by surprise, the hyenas didn't stand a chance. When things appeared to be in their favour, Bruce broke off from the group in search of Mike and John. Eventually, he found John on the 3rd floor of a private clinic. Bruce called out, demanding John stand down right away. However, it was at this time that he noticed the blood-covered knife in his hand and realized there was a body on the table. John claimed that Mike told him to do it when the explosions outside started going off. He didn't want to live with everything he'd done on his conscience. John reached into his vest pocket. Bruce screamed at him to stop moving, but he didn't, and then fired 3 rounds into his chest. He was only reaching for Janice's beeper, but it was too late. Bruce asked why he had her beeper and knife. Bleeding out in front of him, John explained that all he wanted to do was help Mike and understand why he had Janice's things. But he was in the settlement and he wouldn't be able to get in, so he lied to the council in order to get them to raid it, so he could get Mike out. This is why Bruce received the message from Janice's beeper. John was trying to keep him away from the attack. John filled him in on what Mike had said about the night that she went missing, how he had accidentally killed her, and that he took her body away using her dad's car and buried her under the treehouse. With his dying breaths, John asked if he too could be buried next to her. Bruce took both Mike's and John's bodies and buried them next to Janice. He was now the sole survivor of this long-lost group of friends. However, at least now he had some closure of what had happened to Janice. He took a moment to reflect back on their time together in the past, but he knew his job was far from done. So when he was ready, he collected his things and marched towards the city, as at this point in time, his assistance was needed more now than ever. I quite enjoyed this story, but I'm not gonna lie, I don't think it was a great Division story. The Division element could have been replaced with a number of other things, and it wouldn't have changed much. I enjoy the other multimedia editions because they go into a little more detail on the Division universe, or expand on it, offering a little more to the world and everything that's happening. This was more just a story of a group of friends, and how an incident pulled them apart, and then eventually brought them back together later on. Like I said, a good story, but just not what I was after as an addition to the universe. While I have you guys, especially the ones that have made it this far through the video, I have been accused a number of times of trying to seduce you through the way that I talk. While this is certainly not the intention, I have one question. Did it work? Perhaps I should be looking into some sort of ASMR content, though I'm sure my wife wouldn't approve. We do what we can to feed the family, right? Anyway, I hope you found the story entertaining, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers!